Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Erwin Mina. I'm the board president for the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. Today I'm proud and excited to introduce this month's speaker series. The topic is Alaskeros, the unveiling and the presentation. But first, please silence your telephones out of respect for the presenters. I'd like to thank those who were involved in this, that created this exhibit, and the presenters. Lois Sahyoun, Jay Paular, Mel LaGasca, Beverly, June Bond, Corey Mina, Terry Torres, and anyone I didn't mention here. Real quick, I wanted to, the first speaker, there will be three speakers. Lois will be the first, Jay will be the second, and Mel. A little about Lois, for those of you who do not know her. Lois has been involved in community service in multiple levels of government, local and federal. She has been a public servant for multiple organizations, both local and outside of Stockton, in an executive level capacity. She unknowingly is an example of a strong and brave Filipino woman, kind of a trait for most of you women here already. So welcome, Lois. We'll get started. But before we get started, I wanted to have Beverly and Mel assist Beverly to unveil the presentation and the exhibit. Please, Mel, can you help Beverly, please? We're using Mel because he's the tall guy. You unclip.
It's because I eat long rice. Short rice.
Yeah, short rice. So if you could grab the clips.
Grab that first because those going to all fall that way. And can you just take the clip off of it?
This is pretty exciting. There hasn't been a new exhibit in a while. And so this month and next month, we're going to have a new one as well.
Take a peek, and this is the first time I've seen it too.
Come on, Mel. If you notice closely, the colors is from the Aurora Borealis. So ladies and gentlemen, this is our exhibit. Okay, for the first speaker, it will be Lois.
And I think I'll just slip it.
Tell me when you're done and then I'll
Okay.
combine.
Okay. I am very excited to be able to participate as a presenter in this project, and this is my first time to see it. But I did, before I start, I wanted to tell you that these parkas are genuine parkas from Alaska. I donated them to the museum. One was mine and one was my daughter. So in the winter months, you'll see many people wearing this kind of jacket. It's very warm, and they're made out of, usually made out of wild rabbit, beaver, and the trimming that you see are usually made out of seal skin. But they're beautiful jackets. There's a company in Anchorage, Alaska that makes these parkas. And this photograph was captured, a friend of mine that I grew up, he's on our local newspaper in Ketchikan, and his son took an aerial view of Ketchikan. And this is my hometown. And that's why I'm very excited, because I get to talk about my roots as a Filipino American. That I was born and raised in Ketchikan, Alaska, and so I'm very familiar with the Filipinos that came to Alaska to work, specifically to my hometown. But my presentation, I broke it up into 4 parts. I'll tell you a little bit about my background, and then of the Filipinos and what they experienced in traveling to Alaska from California. And then the Sunny Point Cannery, which was one of the major canneries in my hometown, where many of the Filipinos that I met from Stockton worked at. And then lastly, what Ketchikan is today. So Ketchikan, Alaska is located right here. It's the first city as you enter Alaska. So it's the closest. As soon as you leave British Columbia, you would enter in Ketchikan, Alaska. My father immigrated to Hawaii in the early 1920s. He worked in the pineapple plantations and later came to California. There are every so many feet on this line, and then they leave it out and then haul in the salmon and put the salmon down in a hole in the main part of the ship where it's packed with ice before they bring the fish to the canneries to be processed. And then my 2 uncles and cousins worked on seiners, and these are the larger boats. After their catches, they come up to the docks of the cannery and unload their fish to be processed. In fact, on my mother's side of our family, 2 of our family members were lost at sea. The Alaskan waters can be very dangerous, and storms all of a sudden happen, but my uncle was caught in a storm with his friend and 2 of their sons, and the boat wrecked on some rocks. The Coast Guard is usually the ones that rescue people that do have accidents on their boats, but they were too late to come, and my uncle they never even found my uncle. And then my cousin, who was the same age as I, was on a king crab boat in the Gulf of Alaska, and he was in touch with my uncle by shortwave radio. They had all of a sudden, there was calm waters, and all of a sudden there was a storm, and these crab boats, I don't know if you ever seen that show on TV where they feature the crab boats going out. I forgot what the name of the show. Yeah, Deadliest Catch. Well, and these are huge ships. The whole thing went under, and they never even found. The Coast Guard looked for that ship for so many days, and they never even found one little piece of that ship. And their names appear on the Alaskan Fishers Memorial in Seattle. So if you ever go to Seattle and you go to, you go to Fisherman's Wharf, which is not too far from Pike's Market, they have many of the Alaskan fishermen, that's where they'll dry dock their boats during the winter when it's not fishing season. But their names appear on a very beautiful memorial that was dedicated to all of the Alaskans that were lost at sea fishermen. Ketchikan became a city in 1990, and as I indicated, it's the first city entering Alaska from British Columbia. But the Filipinos, this is probably their first experience when they came to Alaska. It was only accessible by boat or plane. You cannot drive there. And usually they would catch the plane in Seattle. So if they came by boat, they landed at shipping docks in Ketchikan, in downtown Ketchikan. But if they came by plane, because in my hometown there was no airport, so they had to go to a place called Annette Island, which is the only Indian reservation in Alaska, and it's 23 miles from Ketchikan. So from there they would fly, land on a jet airstrip, and then they would take a seaplane or a float plane. Has anybody been on a seaplane or a float plane? Well, if you never have, most likely you'll get sick because you land in the water. Now the float planes, they have the platoons under them, so at least when you land on the water, you sit up. But on the seaplanes, and the Coast Guard uses these kind of planes a lot, you actually land in the water. So when you're looking out the little porthole of the plane, you'll see water covering all the way up. And so that was their first experience in traveling on an airplane. And most of them came by plane. And then they would notice that there was thousands of miles of waterways, and that forest, as far as you could see, where man hasn't even walked on. And in the particular area where I lived is the Tongass National Forest, and it's the largest national forest in the United States. It's approximately 17 million acres of forest and many islands. Ketchikan has only one road, and it's only 32 miles long, so there are more people that own boats than a car, because once you travel at 32 miles, you just turn around and go the other way. And the city, Ketchikan, is built along the waterway and mountainside. So as you can see here, the whole city is built along the waterway. And from where you see the forest there, that goes up to mountains. And they would notice too, there was a limited number of businesses, no big grocery stores or merchandise shops. And it wasn't a diversified population that they came from. It was mainly Caucasian and then native Alaskans. And my particular area, there were 3 native Alaskan tribes that lived there: the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, and the Haidas. And the thing they would notice is all of the boat marinas, the large number of boat owners. And lastly, the rain. Ketchikan averages between 140 to 160 inches a year. So everyone had rain gear and boots. The cannery, the cannery that I was most familiar with was Sunny Point Cannery, and I believe one of the Paulars worked there. It was Ray Paular. And but in the 1930s, there were 13 canneries in Ketchikan. Now, when I grew up there, the population of Ketchikan was under 6,000. So you can imagine there wasn't the population that Filipinos that came from larger cities, especially Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they weren't used to seeing that. And at this cannery, that's where I really got to meet and know the Filipinos that traveled from Stockton to Ketchikan. And one of them, his name was Claro Candelario. I don't know if anybody knows him. I think he's deceased now, but he was wonderful. Like I said, I grew up in the Norwegian culture, so the canneries afforded me the opportunity and introduced me to the Filipino culture. And he was very important with that. He was like, they had their bunk buildings where they stayed and slept. And then they had a huge mess hall and like a social hall. And he was in charge of, he was their head cook. So he planned all the menus for the Filipinos from breakfast to dinner, and when they had parties or celebrated something special, he was the planner. So he really introduced me to Filipino food and certain customs. Like, it was hard for me to, if I called somebody uncle, you were really my uncle. But not there. You called everybody uncle. And that was just one little thing I'll always remember about him. And it was my brother and I too worked in the cannery during my freshman year in high school. But my father would always take us to the cannery because he loved reuniting with those friends, particularly the ones that came from lived in the Lathrop area that came from Bacra, Ilocos Norte in Luzon, northern Luzon. So I hold very special memories. But one thing I always thought about the Filipinos and that I really admired and respected, here when they came to, and you could say it was foreign to them, but they had to learn a lot about the fishing industry too, the processing, and I'm going to pass some photos around that'll show you some of the equipment used in the fish canneries. They had to even learn simply that most people don't know. There's 5 species of salmon. How many knew that? Hardly anyone. And Mel brought some samples, but the top salmon is the king salmon, and that's known. There's an Indian named Chinook, and that's the Alaska state fish. But other salmons are the sockeye, and that's the best salmon to eat, and that's called the red salmon. And then there's the chum salmon, and we have a nickname for that, the dog salmon. So as you go down, the quality goes down, and the appearance of the salmon, they all don't look alike. And then there's the coho salmon, or it's also referred to as the silver salmon, and the pink salmon we call the humpy back, because there is actually a little hump on the back of that salmon. But I'll pass these around so everyone can look at them. So they worked long hours. They had, but they never complained, and they were always happy. And when it was somebody's birthday or even 4th of July, they would join in the festivities in my hometown, which makes a big deal of 4th of July. And they would invite, community members would even join them at the cannery. So it was really a community social gathering, not just for the Filipinos there, but they welcomed the residents of my hometown. And I know my mother and my aunts, we always enjoyed going out there. So that's my personal link with the Filipinos that came to work in the canneries. Very hardworking, very lovable, always had open arms for you, and very knowledgeable after they left Alaska. So Ketchikan today, from 13 canneries, it only has 3 operating canneries now and a cold storage. And a cold storage is a little different than a cannery. Mainly, they do halibut. And halibut, and a lot of people don't know this, halibut can be from this big to 6 feet tall. And that's where they process and freeze the halibut and ship them out from Alaska. And today, when I was growing up, there was a very small, I would say no more than a dozen Filipinos. And they were mainly men, single men. One worked at our post office there, and there was one that was married and had a child. And that's what they called their little Filipino community club. But today, there is a large Filipino community there, and in 2021, they had their first annual Filipino-American Festival. And last October, they had a community celebration of the Filipino-American history. And they also recognize the Filipinos that were called Alaskeros at this celebration. And it's nice to see that the high school that I went to back home, it does have a Filipino-American club now and is very active. But the main attraction now, why you don't see the cannery industry, that has shrunk and the tourism has really boomed. So in my hometown, every day, there's 3 to 6 cruise ships that pass through. And I'm told by friends that I grew up with, the cruise season is mainly from May through the end of September. And there's like 2.2 million people that pass through my hometown, which only has 7,000 people. And that doesn't count the outlying areas, but if it did, it would be 14,000. So you could see most of them are in the tourism business now. And there are some Filipino restaurants there now too. So I do plan to attend those and go to those next time I go back home. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little information.
Thanks, Erwin. Again, my name is Jay Paular. I'm the grandson of Paul Paular, who came from Cavite, Luzon, Philippines around 1925 to Oakland, eventually to Stockton, LA, back to Stockton, and then Sacramento. In Stockton, he was a cook right down the street here on Weber at the Stockton Hotel back in the 40s, and then owned a restaurant on Charter Way called Wilshire Cafe on Charter Way toward the fairgrounds. Paul Jr., my uncle Paul Jr., was born in LA, attended Edison High School here in the late 40s, and he tells me the story. Even now I call him, every week, and he always mentions this story because it's very important to him, so I wanted to share that. While at Edison, his passion was music. He was the number 1 sax, they call it the first chair. He was the top sax player at Edison. And then his last 2 years, they were forced to go to a different school called Stockton High College, or something like that. Stockton High, but had the word college in it, but it was the last few years of high school. And he transferred there in Midtown here. His classmates and even his music teacher didn't appreciate that he was the number 1 chair, and though he was better than the existing students there, they gave him a hard time, a lot of bullying going on then. So he told my grandmother, goes, I'm not going back to school. I'm going to go to Alaska, because Uncle Ray's been there a couple years earlier already. So he left Stockton, went to Alaska. And this is a picture of him. He was on an island called, Lois, if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Azuki. Is Lois doing never?
Right here.
How do you say that? Azuki, I believe, but it's an island, a small island near Ketchikan, I believe. Anyway, he went there for a couple of summers, and then he came back home and decided to go to college. He ended up graduating from Oregon State University with a degree in engineering, and then he became one of the early Fil-Ams in the aerospace industry, initially at Aerojet in Sacramento, then by the late 50s in LA, working for different firms there. And at the time, like in the 80s, I believe, he was on this project. He couldn't even tell the family because it was top secret. It was called the Stealth B-2 bomber, and he was the he was a manager for the engineering of this craft, and it was famous because it was the first craft that cannot be detected by radar. So they say because of that craft, that craft was instrumental in ending the Cold War in Germany and the end of the wall. So when he retired, the last company he worked for gave him this model of the B-2 bomber, and last year he sent it to me. He wanted me to share it with the museum here. I'm glad we have a picture of it here, and I'll probably bring the actual one here for another event to share. My uncle Ray Paular here was the first of my uncles to go to Alaska. Here he is with his buddy, Uncle Cecil Bonzo. You might remember Cecil Bonzo as being one of the first to start the farmers market here in downtown Stockton in the 70s. But he's here with Cecil. There's some other friends here. Sleepy Caballero, many of you know him. I believe my uncle Pastor in Cabo's there with Sleepy. And another area he excelled in was he was a great amateur boxer. And in 1948, he won the silver medal at the Golden Gloves tournament in San Francisco. And one side story, I remember my brother and I were boxing back in the 70s in the garage. You know, we were like 19, 20 years old. Uncle Ray comes over, he's watching us, he goes, "Let me get these gloves on." He goes, "JJ, where's your dad? I want to kick his ass." My dad was hiding out, he didn't want to be out there. But Uncle Ray was another pioneer in his industry. He's one of the first Fil-Ams to be in management of the corrections department in California. Worked at several correction institutions in Southern California, Northern California, and he was acting warden toward the end of his career at different times in Vacaville. Another Stockton native who worked with him was Cardine Villaruz. A lot of you know Art Villaruz. He's past president of our chapter in Merced for FANHS. But his older brother, Cardine, or Richard, worked with Uncle Ray in Alaska. And another thing I want to include that Uncle Ray, who passed away a couple years back, he left an endowment for the Sacramento chapter and another portion for the museum here to fund this project. So again, we thank his family for being here. I want to recognize my cousin Leilani and Lori and their family right here. And I was going through my phone last night. I found some old conversations of Uncle Ray sharing stories, so I'll share it with my cousins and who was interested in the future. But to the end, he had a great memory. He tells us stories, things he did as a kid and growing up in LA, Stockton, and Sacramento, and he lived quite an interesting life, and again we thank him for supporting us by leaving the fund to help fund the museum projects, and I encourage all of us to consider that. Thank you.
Jay Paular, one more applause for Jay Paular. Paular family pioneers Alaskeros. And next up is Mel LaGasca.
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you, the coordinators, Erwin, the president of the museum, Beverly, the do everything graphics person, and I can go on, and Terry is co-founder, as the founder of the museum. These are the core members. These are the ones that keep things going, regardless of how good or bad things are. They keep things going. But on a real quick note, I just learned quite a few stuff here from these folks, and I'll be during the questions and answers. Hopefully, we can bring out more information. But two things I learned is we're all from Edison. The folks that you talked about for our alumni from Edison High School. I'm the class of '65, and of course Ray and the guys a little earlier, and class of '64, I believe. 63 at Edison. So got some Edisonites in here. Whoa. Quickly, I was really trying to imagine what this board looked like, and actually I have it. This is the first time I've seen it, and just like you guys. And I was trying to figure out exactly where to start or where to really dive into, but what I want to do is focus on my intentions. As a high school student, just graduated from high school in 1965, and my personal background is my mom is black and Irish. She's my father's Ilocano from Vigan, and they met in Tacoma, Washington, in Seattle. So that's my roots are in Tacoma, Washington, Seattle, and we moved to Stockton, California in the summer of '54. So I've been in the Stockton area since 1954. But looking at these pictures, I'd like to kind of highlight a few things without being in you guys' way over there. Is this picture here reminds me of when I first thought about going to Alaska. All I thought was being freezing to death up there. So I bought this fake fur jacket thinking that I was going to stay warm, and it didn't help. But thank God the summers up there were nice and warm during the July-August time frame. But this particular picture here was when I first went up there. My first step was to go to Seattle. I went up to Seattle with my stepfather, and we had to get processed in local 37 union, and the Longshoremen's, the International Longshoremen's Union. And turns out my father worked in Ketchikan. So he immediately was dispatched to Ketchikan, but I had to wait. And that was the scary part. Now here's an 18-year-old kid, 1,200 miles, or excuse me, 2,000 miles from home. First time leaving the house, and it's like, dang, man, if I mess up, it's a long walk home. And I said, well, I'm just going to dig in and sort of follow directions. And sure enough, I found out later that my father talked to the dispatcher, and I was able to get on. And I'll just simply say, he talked to the dispatcher, and I was able to get on. And it cost me $50, but anyway, I got on, and I became a longshoreman. And my first year up there, I found out that the Fishing and Game Warden controlled the fishing season. They controlled actually all the canneries along the Gulf Coast. And the season really, and this is the first time I've seen this chart, but Orca Cannery, where I was somewhere up around here, Prince William Sound, near Valdez. That's where the oil slick was way back in when. But The only way we can get to the cannery was by boat. So there was no roads. And when Lois mentioned that was 32 miles there, you go down there, then you got to come back. But that's the same thing here. There was a few roads that led into Cordova, Alaska, but there were no roads to the cannery. So when we arrived in Cordova, Alaska, we had to catch a small boat. This boat took us probably close to a mile along the Alaskan coast there to Orca Cannery. And there's a cannery sitting out there. Here it is here, and it's sitting out there processing fish. And I guess a memorable moment was when I got on this, when probably about 6 of us got on this small boat. The water line along that boat was probably 3 inches, man. It was like, I didn't want to say anything or act like I was scared, but I was scared. I mean, to be in a boat going almost a mile and have 2 or 3 inches of water line was a memorable moment. Just looking at some of the pictures up here, this was part of the cannery, and there were 3 parts to this cannery. There was the fishermen's. They had their own quarters. The cannery workers, they had their own bunkhouse, and this is sort of what the bunkhouse looked like. But I don't have any pictures on the inside. But the bunkhouse housed all the cannery workers. And then there was another ship that's actually parked out there. The Japanese ran the row, the fish eggs. That was totally their responsibility, was to process these fish eggs. So there were really 3 components out there: a fishing group, the cannery workers, and then the Japanese that worked the fish eggs. If you see this picture here, sort of kind of gives you an idea of how the ships came in, and when the fishing boats came in, there was a conveyor belt that actually the fishermen loaded their catch up onto the conveyor belt, and the first station. And if you look at these 5 panels here, just imagine that first panel being the ship unloading the fish. The second panel would be the sorters that sorted out all the fish, because they fish with these seine nets, and they would catch anything. I mean, they would catch trout and you name it. So when they start hauling this the fish off of the ship, somebody had to sort it, because otherwise we'd be canning halibut and you name it. So the sorters did all that work. And then these guys were butchers and what they call slimers. And these guys would clean the fish up, and as this conveyor belt was going along, and they would trim the fins and the head off of the fish. And then right here was a fillet-feeder. The fillet-feeder was my first job. I was to pack the fish into the can to make sure it was either a 1-pound can or a half-pound can. And so there were probably 5 or 6 of us, and each station there were several guys working them. But it was long and tedious. I mean, you're constantly on your feet, and wet. Everybody had boots, rain gear especially, to protect ourselves from the water and stuff. But that was my job. The first job was fillet-feeder, and we would be filling these cans to make sure that they were within specs, within that 1-pound or half-pound fish, a can of fish, just to make sure we were in compliance. So when they put that label on there, it said it was 1 pound, it really was 1 pound. And then it went to the warehousemen. They actually moved these cans, if you can see these cans up here, into a big pressure cooker. They actually cooked the fish in a can. It was raw when they put it in there, and they stuck it in these cans and put it in the pressure cooker for several hours, and they literally cooked the fish in the can. And it was amazing to me. I was always wondering, how do they have to cook that and then stick it in there? And man, what a process. But they figured it out, and it really was a pretty neat process. And when I did have the opportunity to work in the warehouse in my second year up there in 66, it turns out that the warehouse work was different than the cannery. We were handling large crates of stuff, using forklifts to move things around, but there was a machine called the inverter. Now this inverter had probably 100 cans in it, and your job was to invert those cans and move them off onto another conveyor belt where they package it up into a dozen cans or 2 dozen cans. And that was dangerous because there was big metal plates that we had to hang on to, and bam, we would invert these cans, and it would go down a processing line. So that was one of the things that sort of stuck in my mind, was I had to make sure I came home with all my fingers, and I didn't come home with any nubs. This particular picture over here was some of the guys that I met up there in Alaska. It turns out their intentions of being in Alaska were slightly different than mine. I was totally focused on making money, taking that check home, and applying it to my education. Bam, that was my goal. I was on a mission. It was a man on a mission. And some of these guys, they did that seasonal work, and that's what they did. They did seasonal work in agriculture, and as they moved through the season, they'd go back up to Alaska and work for the union and work for the New England Fish Company. But it was quite an experience working with a group of folks that were around my age, maybe a little older. But then I also worked with the older folks. I got to meet a few of the fishermen, and we snapped a few pictures here. Some of the locals, one of the, we call them beauty queens, one of the ladies that worked in the cannery. Everybody wanted to take a picture with her, man, and send it home. Says, this is my friend. And there's probably 9 or 10 of us that took a picture like this with a lady. Her name is Susan, and I found out later that she moved to Los Angeles, somewhere in Los Angeles. But she was a local. Her family lived in Cordova, Alaska, and she worked seasonal work in the cannery. And this couple here was from Seattle. It was kind of an interesting background. When I first got to the cannery, there were signs all over the cannery says, absolutely no gambling. About every 10 or 15 feet, man, you see these signs, it's just repetitious, absolutely no gambling. And about 2 weeks into the cannery season, the supervisor was the first one to bring out the cards and says, who wants to play cards? And I said, wait a minute, we got a disconnect. These signs out here says absolutely no gambling, and all of a sudden, you know, that's what they did for recreation, I guess. It was tough work up there. But this guy right here was one of the guys that ran the poker. He ran poker games and stuff. And I learned that, well, if you want to go home with your money, you know, if you want to double your money, you fold it over and you put it in your pocket. But another interesting picture here is me with a guy named George Plaza. Anybody here know George Plaza? Yes, George Plaza was my actually roommate, and a guy named musician Jimmy Tino. Jimmy Tino was my roommate. And these guys were musicians. I didn't realize that, so when I first was assigned a bunkhouse, they put the people from Stockton in this kind of same area. And that was the first time I met Jimmy Tino and the Tino family and George Plaza. And I believe they're both have passed on now, but quite interesting. I would wake up in the morning sometimes to this sound of the loo-loo-loo, loo-loo-loo-loo. Jimmy Tino was a saxophone player, and he was a good jazz saxophone player. But I said, oh man, I'm going to be up here. I got a 6-month or a 2-month contract, 60 days, and I got to listen to this. Well, long story short, it turned out to be we got to know each other, and we became good friends. I got to know the Tino family, Rudy Tino, Jimmy Tino, and Josie, and had to go all the way to Alaska to find these people from Stockton. This last picture here is one of a guy that was in charge of crabbing. During the season, once the season started, if you can imagine this area here at the end of the belt, the conveyor belt. Once they start processing the fish heads, they would just simply dump them in the bay. I mean, there would literally be a pile of fish waste, heads and fins and you name it. And guess what? After about a week or so, the bears are going, must be cannery season. And the seagulls start collecting. There would be hundreds of seagulls along the housing lines, and then the bears would slowly come out of the woods. So the supervisor would constantly remind us, before you leave the bunkhouse, look both ways, kind of like crossing the street. Yeah. So that's what we did. Before we left that bunkhouse, we made sure there were no bears hanging around out there to eat us and the salmon out there. Another thing was, at 8 o'clock sharp, there was a big steam whistle that went off and went, you can probably hear it all over the town, but it scared the seagulls, and a scared seagull has a tendency to release thing. And if you were out there when that whistle blew, so that's another thing I learned out there. Don't be hanging around there where the birds are when the alarm went off, because it scared them. I guess in a nutshell, I used to do, before I went up to Alaska, I used to do seasonal work. And it turns out, maybe in a month, I'd probably make $150 to $250 working weekends. I had a work permit that said I cannot work during school hours. So it did protect us from, I guess, child labor laws, saying you can't work during school hours. So I did a quick calculation. I said, well, if I go up there and the union is guaranteeing me 2 months' wages at least $400 a month, I knew I was going to walk away with at least $800. Well, it turns out the Fishing and Game Warden shut the season down before the 2 months, and I really never worked in the 3 seasons more than 38 days. But we got paid for 2 months' wages. And that was a good thing, but we made a lot of money on overtime, because when the fishing boats come in, you got to can it, because that fish has been on ice for I don't know how many, a few days, so they got to get it off the boats and can it. But quite an experience. I mean, definitely some memorable moments. Some of the quick memorable moments was, I guess, sweating it out in the union hall, thinking that if I ran out of money, you know, I'd be headed back to Stockton. But because I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington, which is only probably 25 minutes from Seattle. I have family there I could back up in case I got down to a few dollars, you know, be knocking on, guess who's coming to dinner. But luckily I budgeted enough money to survive that wait up there. And the other one was the 800-mile trip on a prop engine. Now, when they flew the guys up to the Canneries, that was really the first time I was in a prop engine. I mean, this aircraft had 4 engines on it, 2 on each side, and it can hold probably 30, 35 people in it. And it was noisy, noisy, noisy. And got past that, but really what caught my attention on this flight is that when you're flying into mountain ranges, you have, I don't know whether you call them thermal or wind shifts. When the wind blows up over the mountain ridges, it causes turbulation, and when the aircraft flies into that, it drops and it goes back up, and it drops and it goes back up. And I don't know, I probably changed my clothes after I landed, after that trip. Another memorable moment was when we brought out the fishing nets and the crab nets, and this guy right here was in charge of cooking all the crab. What we would do is take the fish heads, stuff them in a big round crab net, had a one-way gate on it, and 2 of us would bring the fish heads in the crab net out, and we'd drop them out in the bay and leave them out there for about a week and a half. It took us 4 guys to pull those crab nets up. We got out there and we were pulling these crab nets up with these fish heads, and the crab were hanging out from the outside trying to grab the fish heads, and so we had to throw them back in. And we also had to comply with, I think there was a rule about the female crab, you couldn't keep them. So they had a marking, I think they had a blue marking on them or something like that, and we threw those all back. But this guy right here was in charge of cooking them. He let us know when the crab was done, we ate as much as we want. And it's like I really pigged out on some crabs. So that was a memorable moment. Yeah, second to the last was receiving that full check. My first check was close to $1,100, and I worked probably 36 days. And compared to the time I worked in the fields prior to that, making $150, maybe $200 a month working on weekends, that $1,100 looked good. And of course you said, well, I'm going to pay for some schooling, pay for a vehicle. The first thing I had to do was get a car. And I ended up purchasing a 61 Chevy. And I think it was around $900. I didn't want to throw all the money into it, so my dad co-signed. He co-signed for the 61 Chevy and paid $900 for it, and the second season I went up there, we paid it off. But I gave Mom and Dad some money, but the last thing was being in the great outdoors. It is absolutely amazing to be in an area that's wilderness. Literally is wilderness, and to be able to go to work, the only way you can get there was by boat. The people that you work with were from all ages, and for all reasons they were up there. Some were working because that's what they did for seasonal work, and I was up there solely to make enough money to go to school and purchase a car and keep moving on. In 1968, in 67, I graduated from Delta College and ended up working at Sandia National Lab. And I spent 34 years in a weapons lab. And over the 34 years, I worked in drafting, telemetry work. I was a first line supervisor in computing. And I was looking at some of the work that the other presenters presented. They did a lot of things when they were younger to meet their goal, their end goal. And it was such an honor to work with the older Manoms and just to experience the camaraderie. Someone mentioned that there was always humor. Of all the tough work that was done, they always found room for humor. And with that, I would like to mention that over on the table, I've got some samples of my binder. I for some reason or another, took a bunch of pictures from an old Ansco camera, and there's some canned salmon up there and some pictures of sockeye salmon and pink salmon. When Lois mentioned the two different types, just think of it as a filet mignon being a sockeye salmon and a chuck steak being a pink salmon. So with that, thank you.
Anyone that has any questions? Yes.
I have a question. Mel, you mentioned that there was 1 and 2 pound salmon cans. How did you know that they were a pound or 2 pounds? How did you know that the weight was correct?
Well, they had actually it wasn't high tech. They visually looked at it and say, well, if it's packed to the top, it's good. So that was the calibration we used. I mean, there was some quality control, but nothing like in industry where you get it right down to the micro ounce. We looked at it and said, oh, this needs more in there. And another thing was, when they did change the line, we ran that line all day. If it was a half pound, we ran it all day. And if it was a full pound, we ran the full pound all day. So we didn't have to worry about remembering, you know, how much to put in the half pound or a full pound.
Thank you.
I did want to make a couple other comments. When Mel indicated that one of the reasons he went to Alaska was to earn more pay to help with his education. Well, not only Filipinos his age that went there for that purpose, there were college students from all over the United States that would come. So I met so many college students from the East Coast to the West Coast that would come and spend 38 days and make more money than they could wherever they came from, whatever state. Another notation, today the largest minority group, incoming minority group to Alaska are the Filipinos, because many stayed there to establish a home, and Kodiak Island, which is right here, is a large population of Filipinos. And my uncle on the Norwegian side, he is a past mayor of that island. And then this whole area, which is called southeastern Alaska, the Panhandle, I talked about, you can only go to my hometown by boat or plane. That is sticks for the whole Panhandle of Alaska. And this is almost the size and length of California. Very large. But I like to tell those traveling from California, because when I worked for the county, everyone that went to Alaska, I was always known as the Alaska girl. They would always come and ask me, how should I go tour Alaska? And if you do, you could drive to Seattle. And Alaska has one of the best ferry systems in the world, where they have a continuous ferry system where you can drive your car right on the ferry boats, and you could stop as long as you want at each of the communities, because they have a continuous schedule of ferry boats that run through all southeastern Alaska. No other questions?
Did anybody get tired of eating salmon?
No. No. And seafood was plentiful. I mean, back in those days, we might feed king crab to our cats. So, many of our recreation as teenagers was different than the recreation here. I had to adjust coming here. Recreation there, I'd go clam digging, crab, we put out, like he described, the crab traps. We all had our own skiff, would go out and set the crab traps and then go back. We would have bonfires on the beaches and cook salmon, do that. And I think the first time I came to Stockton, I had a date and went to that person's house, and the father brought out a fish. I told him I would clean it. And my date left. Had second thoughts about dating. So life was completely different. Thanks for asking that, though. No, you never get tired of seafood. It was plentiful. Yes.
Another point to add, when we were up in the cannery in Orca, Alaska, we actually didn't eat much fish. I mean, we had these chuck steaks, just about every day. Chuck steaks were probably the cheapest, but they were the toughest, but they give us a big old chuck steak, and we didn't eat much fish, unless one of the guys saved maybe the trout that they threw out, that the sorters picked out, and they grabbed it and gave it to the cook to cook it up. But not much fish. That's a good question. And, you'd think we'd be eating a lot of salmon up there, but no.
Mel mentioned about the Japanese retrieving the fish eggs.
The road,
Yeah, and there were always Japanese ships that came to Alaska.
I wanted to make a comment here. Oh, wait, there's
I just
someone.
wanted to thank, Lois for we have cookie that's there and the coffee, and then my niece Lori's two gentlemen that are sitting here at the audience, 2 trays of lumpia. So thank you very much.
Okay, I want to make a comment of what Mel said. He said there was camaraderie and there was this certain community, and it kind of reminds me of Bayanihan, and that would be something that all of us here all know about. Anyway, so if there's no other questions, what I'd like to do is, first of all, let's have a picture. Take a picture before we all go. And then the last thing is Lois and several other people brought delicious lumpias, coffee. So I'd like to invite everybody in, and I'm going to do it in 2 languages. Mangan tayo, Ilocano, which is Ilocano from most of us. And then Kaina would be the Visayan side, and then the Tagalog side. So with everybody, one more question.
I just wanted to thank everybody for putting on this display, this wonder exhibit. My Aunt Bev, I know she works so hard on doing all of these exhibits. This is my dad, Jay Paular. Whenever he would mention working in Alaska, his eyes would just always be so bright, and he would always share happy memories, And I know it was hard work and everything, but just seeing him on this forklift, right? And I'm like, what are you doing on this forklift? And I didn't know that salmon was cooked in the cans. I never knew that. And my dad, my mom, she'd always have salmon. My dad salmon again? No. But I remember opening the cans, my mom cooking, and the little bones, how they're soft. And that was like my treat. I was like, oh, this is so good. I love this. But yeah, my dad, when he was 12 years old, he worked in the fields here in Stockton, making 12 cents per sack, and growing up, and then just doing grapes and Lodi and everything. And he said, you know what, I need to do something else. And his uncle is the one that recruited him to do this when he was 16. And I just have happy memories, because I remember going to my dad's albums when I was little, and I just remember seeing all these pictures. Like, who's this and who's that? I didn't even know Pastor and Cobble Jr. It's right there. And, I just want to thank everybody. I just get emotional because I took this picture of my dad right here. And my dad, he was a real people person. He passed away in 2020. And I think it was really because he was lonely, the COVID and everything, couldn't be around people, couldn't get a haircut, he couldn't be, with his family. And I was like talking through a screen, how can you survive that, right? And it's like, oh, sorry. But I know my dad's looking down right now, and he's so happy seeing everybody. He's really smiling, I can feel it. So I just want to say thank you to everybody.
Okay, even Filipinos in the camps of southern San Joaquin recognized the Alaskeros. They were known to be adventurous and very courageous. So I just wanted to give that input from when we were growing up. But thank you, everybody. Paular family, Jay, Bev, and Lois, and everybody that was involved in this, and Terry, as well as June Bond, and my wife, Corey.
We wanted to announce that if anybody else has a story to tell, we would like to hear it. We would like to record it and then perhaps exhibit it also. So, for not necessarily just Alaskeros, you guys need to tell your stories. You need to write them down. You need to record it. You need to preserve it. You need to teach the next generation about it. So if you're interested in doing something like that and you need help, let us know. And then, join us again for our next thing that's coming up in September 24th. We have the author Cindy Fozzie, who's going to be talking about her new book called Molto. It's a thriller about a PI detective. Check our Facebook page. Our webpage just has info, but the Facebook has the updated stuff. And tell us your stories. You gotta write them down. No one's gonna tell them but you, if you want it told right. So contact us.
Thank you, Terry.
Please let everybody know that this very special exhibit will be here until December. Okay, so get the word out so that everyone else can come and enjoy and learn about this very important part of our history. Thank you.
Just call us and make an appointment.
Okay, comment here is if we don't represent, someone will represent for us. So let's get out there. And now for the most shameful part of my job is we are a 501c nonprofit. And so if you feel in your heart to give us a donation, we'd appreciate it. So that concludes our presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.